When you think of the word freedom, what is what's the very first thing that pops into your mind?
Oh, that's a big question to start with.
Right. But if you are like most people listening to this right now, your brain probably immediately conjures up a highly physical image.
Yeah, absolutely.
You might picture, escaping heavy iron chains, unlocking a rusty jail cell, breaking out of a literal cage, or maybe running breathlessly across a border to safety.
And that makes total sense. I mean, physical liberation is the most visceral version of being free.
Exactly. It is the most immediate and universally understood version. It's the stuff of action movies and, well, history books. But what if I told you that escaping the physical chains is really only the very first step of a much longer journey?
Right, because it doesn't end there.
It doesn't. What if true, lasting, generational freedom isn't just about unlocking the cage, but about finally being able to tell your own story?
Yeah.
About how you got out, why you were in there to begin with, and what you're going to do next.
That is the exact question we're going to be unpacking today, and it is such a critical distinction for us to make right at the top of this deep dive.
I completely agree.
Because if you only view freedom as a physical state, simply the absence of physical restriction, or the ability to move your body from point A to point B, you miss the entire underlying architecture of how true empowerment is actually built.
And sustained, too.
Yes, built and sustained. What's fascinating to explore here is that the transition from a physical state of being free to a psychological, cultural, and institutional state of owning your narrative is it's a complex, multi-layered journey. It doesn't happen overnight.
And it certainly doesn't happen by accident.
No, not at all.
And to explore how that actually happens, we have an incredibly unique stack of sources today. We're looking at a fascinating combination of materials that you don't typically see paired together.
This is a really cool pairing.
On one hand, we have excerpts from a very specific, detailed historical text called The Chronicles of the Diaspora, a March Almanac. It's essentially a day-by-day historical record. Yeah. And on the other hand, we have a brilliantly concise analytical framework that accompanies it, titled The Liberation of the Narrative. Our mission today is to take these two sources and overlay them.
Which is going to be so revealing.
We aren't just going to rattle off a dusty list of historical dates that coincidentally happened to fall in the month of March. Instead, we are going to use this one specific week in March as a magnifying glass.
A magnifying glass to witness a profound evolutionary shift in human history. To clearly lay out the thesis from the liberation of the narrative for everyone listening, we need to understand that this framework is challenging us.
Challenging us how?
It's challenging us to track a very specific, deliberate progression. The thesis argues that if we look closely at the events clustered in this particular week in March, we can trace a clear movement of human agency.
From the physical to the cultural.
Exactly. We move from the foundational physical liberation of the body through the logistical building of networks, all the way to the complex cultural liberation of the voice, the image, and the sound.
It is essentially a roadmap.
It is. It shows how marginalized groups move from simply fighting to exist without chains to actively directing their own cultural and historical destiny on a global scale.
I want to unpack this right away because there is one specific quote from the Liberation of the Narrative text that absolutely stopped me in my tracks when I first read it in our research.
I think I know which one you're going to say.
It acts as the central argument for our entire deep dive today. The text explicitly states, and I quote, "Freedom is not just leaving the plantation. It is owning the story, the stage, and the sound of the journey."
That phrasing is just incredibly powerful, isn't it?
It really is.
Leaving the plantation represents that initial crucial step of physical emancipation. It is the literal removal of the physical bonds of enslavement, colonization, or acute oppression. You have to have that.
The absolute bare minimum.
Right. But the quote demands that we look further down the timeline. Owning the story means claiming the historical record, writing the textbooks, and defining the narrative of what happened from your own perspective.
Rather than the perspective of the oppressor.
Exactly. Owning the stage refers to the visual representation, how you are seen by the world, the complexity of your image in theater, in film, in public life, refusing to be a caricature.
And then the sound.
And finally, owning the sound points to the cultural resonance, the music, the broadcasted voice that carries the emotional truth of that journey to the rest of the globe.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the framework implies that until you own the story, the stage, and the sound, your freedom is still, in some very real ways, conditional.
Conditional, yes. It can be revoked or rewritten by someone else.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Why should you care about this specific progression? I promise you that by the time we wrap up this deep dive, you're going to look at history entirely
Oh,
differently.
you really will.
You won't see it as just a bunch of disconnected events to memorize for a test. You know, a random Tuesday in 1841 here, a Wednesday in 1959 there.
Right, isolated facts.
Instead, you are going to see a continuous, evolving, and highly deliberate chain of empowerment. You'll see how the baton gets passed from someone fighting for the bare minimum right to legally exist to someone decades later fighting for the right to be seen as a complex, flawed, beautiful human being on a movie screen.
It's a beautiful trajectory.
So if you are ready to completely reframe how you view historical progress, let's jump into part one, the foundation, the physical liberation of the body.
And there is truly no better place to start building this foundation than with the stark, uncompromising legal precedent of physical liberation.
The law.
The law, exactly. Because before you can own the story, before you can worry about representation or music, you must officially, legally own yourself.
Right. It's the prerequisite for humanity. So we open the Almanac, and the very first date we land on is March 9, 1841. This is the date of the landmark Amistad Supreme Court decision.
A massively important moment.
Now, the facts as laid out in our source are striking in their legal clarity, but the human story behind them is intense. In 1839, a group of kidnapped Africans from the Mende secretly freed themselves from their chains aboard a Spanish ship called the Amistad.
They took immense physical risk.
It took control of the ship, demanding to be sailed back to Africa. But through navigational trickery by the surviving crew, the ship ended up off the coast of New York and was intercepted by the U.S. Navy.
Which kicked off a massive legal battle.
A multi-year legal battle that went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And on March 9, 1841, the court ruled that these individuals were free. They were not property.
That distinction is everything.
And the specific reasoning noted in our text is that this ruling was made because the international transatlantic slave trade had already been outlawed, making their initial capture illegal.
Let's really pause and examine the exact wording and the sheer weight of this moment, because this legal distinction is the bedrock of everything else we will discuss today.
Moving from property to individuals.
Yes. Moving from the legal category of property to the legal category of free individuals is a monumental shift in the architecture of society. Think deeply about what property is in a legal and philosophical sense.
It's just an object.
Property has no agency. Property cannot make a contract. Property has no voice in a court of law. Property certainly has no right to a narrative or a legacy. Property is simply an object that is acted upon by an owner.
Which is horrifying when applied to a human being.
It is. By securing a ruling from the highest court in the land, argued, by the way, by former President John Quincy Adams on behalf of the Mende people, that declares these human beings are not property, but rather free individuals, we see the foundational first step of our overarching thesis.
This is the absolute reclaiming of the physical body under the law.
It is the absolute prerequisite. You can't write a best-selling memoir or direct a Broadway play if the law of the land dictates that you are legally indistinguishable from a piece of cargo or a barrel of molasses.
And what stands out to you listening to this is probably how terrifyingly recent 1841 really is in the grand scheme of human history.
Oh, it's basically yesterday.
We are talking about the highest legal authority in a modern nation having to formally debate and declare whether human beings are humans or items.
It is chillingly recent. And the fact that this entire ruling hinged on the specific illegality of the transatlantic trade shows how freedom often has to be fought for within the intricate, sometimes cold mechanics of the legal system.
It wasn't just a moral plea.
No, this wasn't just a broad moral victory or a philosophical debate. It was a legally binding reclassification of humanity in the eyes of the state. It set a precedent. It said, the physical body belongs to the individual.
You cannot own another person's physical form.
That is the absolute base layer of the pyramid of liberation we are climbing today. Without that ruling, nothing else we talk about today can exist.
Which brings us beautifully and honestly quite poetically to the very next day in our March Almanac. We move from March 9 to March 10, but we jump forward in time to the year 1913.
The transition of Harriet Tubman.
Exactly. This is the date our source marks as the transition of Harriet Tubman. Now, the language used in the Almanac here is incredibly deliberate and fascinating. It doesn't just say she died of pneumonia at age 91.
The phrasing matters so much here.
It says the Moses of her people transitioned on this day. And it specifically notes, with great emphasis, that she was buried with full military honors.
The word transitioned is doing a massive amount of heavy lifting in this text, and it perfectly aligns with the liberation of the narrative framework.
How so?
Think about the connotations. When you say someone died, it implies an ending, a full stop, a cessation of influence. But when you say someone transitioned, it implies a continuation into another form or another phase of existence.
A shift in how they operate in the world.
Right. And if we look at the specific details provided, that she was buried with full military honors at Fort Hill Cemetery, we see an incredible validation of her physical strategic reality.
She wasn't just a symbol.
Harriet Tubman wasn't just an inspiring symbol during her life. She was a tactical, physical operator. She moved bodies from captivity to freedom under the cover of darkness. She gathered intelligence.
Earning military honors is a formal, institutional recognition of her role as a combatant for freedom, essentially a general in a very real, very physical war for bodily autonomy.
Precisely.
I always kind of thought of her in this purely heroic, almost mythic light, running through the woods, leading people to the north. But getting a military burial grounds her in the reality that she was executing military-grade logistics and operations.
She was a strategist.
The Almanac explicitly states that this day, her transition and burial marks the official end of the physical Underground Railroad era. But here is where it gets incredibly fascinating, and where we see the narrative shift happen in real time.
This is my favorite part of the analysis.
The text says this date also marks the start of her legend as a spiritual link. What does that mean in the context of our framework?
This is a perfect distillation of our thesis in action. Harriet Tubman spent her entire adult life in the realm of physical liberation, literally moving feet across ground, hiding in physical spaces, dealing with the harsh physical realities of the Underground Railroad. The cold, the dogs, the bounty hunters.
All the visceral physical danger.
But upon her transition in 1913, she is liberated from the constraints of the physical body. She can no longer physically lead people, but she becomes a narrative force. She becomes a spiritual link, as the text calls it.
So she evolves into a story.
Yes. This raises an important question. How do physical leaders become permanent narrative icons? They do it by becoming symbols that future generations can draw power from. Her story, her legend, becomes a tool for the next phase of liberation.
She's no longer just a person who freed people. She is the Moses of her people.
An archetype, a permanent fixture in the collective narrative of freedom that civil rights leaders decades later will reference to fuel their own courage.
It's like she graduated from the physical realm of freedom fighting into the narrative realm. While she was alive, she could only physically reach and free the hundreds of people she personally guided.
But as a spiritual link and a narrative icon, her story can inspire millions. She is no longer bound by geography or time.
And that perfectly sets up part 2 of our deep dive today. The architecture of liberation building the global network. Because once you have that foundational bodily freedom secured by the law, and once you have those spiritual legends like Tubman to guide your morale, you have to actually start organizing.
You can't just rely on individual escapes anymore. You need logistics.
Individual freedom is a vital spark, but to change the world on a systemic level, you need an engine. You need architecture. You need to connect the dots across cities, across oceans, and across vastly different experiences of oppression.
It's the difference between surviving and building.
Which brings us to a really eye-opening entry in the early March cycles of our almanac. The text points out that historical archival notes place the logistical coordination for the very first Pan-African Conference in London during these early March days in the year 1900.
Just think about the timing of that. 1900.
Right. When I read the phrase logistical coordination, my mind immediately goes to the unglamorous behind-the-scenes work. We are talking about the year 1900. There is no internet. There are no global group chats, no instant translation apps.
No quick emails to confirm a venue.
You have people from Africa, the Caribbean, the United States, and the UK trying to organize a global summit in the heart of the British Empire.
It is the unglamorous work, absolutely. But it is the most vital work of any movement. What's fascinating here is that the text specifically highlights the preparation and the logistical coordination.
It deliberately doesn't just focus on the grand speeches given at the conference itself.
Right. It focuses on the architecture of making the conference happen at all. This is a crucial step in the liberation of the narrative. To own the story on a global scale, you have to build a global stage.
The stage requires scaffolding.
The Pan-African Conference was a monumental attempt to connect the diaspora people of African descent scattered across the globe by the slave trade and colonization into a unified political and cultural voice. But before you can have that unified voice, someone has to physically book the Westminster Town Hall in London.
Someone has to write hundreds of letters by hand.
Someone has to figure out the complex travel routes by steamship and raise the funds to buy the tickets. Freedom requires logistics.
This marked the definitive transition from individual escape, like a single person navigating the Underground Railroad, to organized, collective, international action.
It's the difference between one person shouting in a crowded room and building a synchronized global broadcasting system. You need the engineers to build the system first.
And speaking of the people who actually build that architecture, our sources draw a massive, bold underline beneath the role of Black women. On both March 8th and March 10th, the Almanac shifts its focus entirely to what it calls invisible labor.
Yes, and this is where the analytical framework becomes highly granular and incredibly important.
By explicitly tying International Women's Day on March 8th to a diaspora focus, the Almanac challenges us to look at the global labor and civil rights movements and ask a hard question.
Who is actually doing the work that isn't making the headlines?
Exactly. The term invisible labor is critical here. It refers to the organizing, the educating, the grassroots fundraising, the emotional support, the community building, the feeding of activists.
The very logistical coordination we just talked about.
That is overwhelmingly performed by women and historically deeply undervalued or entirely left out of the history books.
To bring us out of the abstract and into reality, the Almanac gives us two absolute powerhouses to look at. Let's start with March 10th, 1845, which is the birth of Hallie Quinn Brown.
She is described as an educator, an author, and an activist who helped found the National Association of Colored Women, or the NACW, in the late 19th century.
But the detail that the text really emphasizes is her codified philosophy, which became the motto of the NACW.
Lifting as we climb.
Lifting as we climb. If we take a moment to really analyze that phrase, it is a masterclass in community architecture and narrative reframing.
It completely flips the traditional script.
It does. Think about the standard metaphor of climbing a mountain or climbing the corporate or social ladder. The traditional, highly individualistic Western narrative of success is that you climb to the top through your own grit, you plant your personal flag at the summit, and maybe you look down at everyone else who didn't make it.
It's a solo journey.
But lifting as we climb fundamentally rejects that narrative. It says that your upward mobility, your personal liberation, is inextricably linked to the liberation of the person below you.
You cannot ethically take a step up without simultaneously reaching down and pulling someone else up with you.
It codifies the transition from the individual escape we saw in the physical liberation phase to a systematic, community-wide elevation. Hallie Quinn Brown wasn't just teaching students in a classroom. She was engineering a philosophy of collective narrative ownership.
She was saying the story of our freedom isn't about one exceptional person making it. It's about the entire community rising together.
That is so powerful. Lifting as we climb, it completely redefines what success means within a marginalized community. It makes success a team sport rather than an individual pursuit.
And then we jump back slightly to March 8th. And the Almanac introduces us to the legacy of Claudia Jones. I have to say, diving into her entry was an absolute light bulb moment for me.
Oh, she is brilliant.
The text calls her a pioneer of the triple oppression theory. It specifically defines this as the intersection of race, class, and gender. Can you break down why this was such a revolutionary way to look at the narrative back then?
Claudia Jones is a phenomenal example of intellectual and analytical liberation. Look at what she is doing with the triple oppression theory, largely formulated in the late 1940s and 50s. She is looking at the standard narrative of oppression, which at the time was often viewed through a single, isolated lens.
People were very siloed in their activism.
Extremely. For example, traditional labor movements looked almost exclusively at class, the struggle of the worker against the wealthy elite. Traditional civil rights movements often looked primarily at race. And early feminist movements largely focused on gender, often centering white middle-class women.
So everyone had their one specific lane.
Claudia Jones steps in and says, no, the story is much more complex than that. She is articulating that a Black working-class woman experiences oppression not as three separate, distinct burdens that she carries one at a time, but as a unique, interwoven matrix of marginalization.
Right, because if she goes to the traditional labor union for help with her factory wages, she might be excluded because of her race or gender.
And if she goes to the racial equality movement, they might be focusing on the specific issues facing middle-class men ignoring her economic reality.
Exactly. She is insisting on a more complex, highly accurate narrative of the struggle. She recognized that you cannot fully liberate someone if you only address one-third of the forces keeping them down.
That kind of intersectional analytical framework was light years ahead of its time. It completely changed the architecture of how activists understood who they were fighting for.
Totally ahead of its time. And the amazing thing about Claudia Jones is that she didn't just sit in a room and write theories. She built the physical architecture to support them.
She was a builder through and through.
The text notes that after she was deported from the U.S. to the U.K., she became the founder of the West Indian Gazette and instrumental in founding what would become the London Carnival. And it says through these specific actions, she actively connected the Caribbean struggle to the UK and the US.
This brings us right back to the logistics of freedom and the Pan-African network we discussed with the 1900 conference. By founding a newspaper, the West Indian Gazette, she is creating a literal, physical platform for the narrative.
Giving them a voice.
She is giving a unified voice to the Caribbean diaspora living in London, allowing them to share news, political thought, and cultural pride. And by organizing those early indoor Caribbean carnivals, she is creating a cultural space, a physical and sonic manifestation of identity in the heart of the former British Empire.
She is using media and culture to bind the diaspora together.
She is ensuring that the struggle against racism and classism in the Caribbean is understood by the diaspora in London, and that it resonates with the civil rights movements happening simultaneously in the United States. She is weaving the global network together with printing ink, steel pans, and celebration.
Okay, we have one more crucial piece of the architecture to discuss in this section, and it involves the March 14th memorial cycle for Fannie Lou Hamer. Now, the Almanac notes a really fascinating chronological quirk here, and it's a brilliant example of how history is actively used in the present.
It's a very strategic use of memory.
It points out that Fannie Lou Hamer, the legendary voting rights activist, was actually born in October. However, archival Hamer Days and community memorial cycles dedicated to her often launch in mid-March.
Which begs the question, why?
Well, looking at the Almanac, it states clearly that these cycles are designed to coincide directly with local and national voting rights pushes. And to be clear for the listener, we're just reporting what the text says here about the mechanics of this timing.
And this is where we see the architecture of the narrative intersecting directly with civic duty. It's fascinating how the Almanac frames this. It explicitly ties the timing of her memorial cycle directly to the mechanics of voting and civic participation.
Right. It's not just about remembering her for the sake of nostalgia. It's about deploying her memory as a tool for action.
Exactly. It shows how the narrative of a historical figure is actively utilized to drive contemporary civic engagement. Fannie Lou Hamer's legacy is so deeply intertwined with the grueling, dangerous, and often violent work of securing voting rights for Black Americans in the South. Her memory is a catalyst.
By aligning Hamer Days in mid-March to coincide with the lead-up to primary elections or voter registration drives, the architects of these cycles are essentially deploying her narrative.
They are deploying it to remind the community of the immense physical and emotional cost of the vote. It reminds people of the ongoing necessity of political agency. It is a very practical, functional application of owning the story.
The story of Fannie Lou Hamer isn't just a biography to be read passively in a library. It is a mechanism used to encourage direct participation in the democratic process today.
It's taking that spiritual link concept we saw with Harriet Tubman and applying it directly to the voting booth. It's brilliant logistical strategy.
So to recap where we are on this journey, we started with the sheer physical liberation of the body getting legally declared human, not property, in 1841.
The essential first step.
Then we moved into complex architecture building, the global networks in 1900, recognizing the vital, invisible labor of women, adopting the philosophy of lifting as we climb, understanding the intersection of race, class, and gender, and organizing the vote.
The logistical foundation.
Now that the foundation is poured and the network is built and humming, it's time to step out of the logistics room and into the spotlight. It is time for part 3, liberating the image, owning the stage and the screen.
This is where the transition from pure survival to true cultural ownership becomes incredibly visible to the broader public. When a group of people has been historically marginalized, the broader dominant society almost always dictates their image.
The dominant culture writes the caricatures.
They write the caricatures, they create the harmful stereotypes, they tell the world exactly who you're supposed to be, usually to justify their own power. Liberating the image means taking the pen, taking the camera, stepping into the spotlight and saying to the world, no, your caricature is a lie. this is who we actually are.
And there is perhaps no bigger, more scrutinized spotlight in the world than Broadway. Our almanac drops us right onto the Great White Way on March 11th, 1959. This is the date of the Broadway premiere of a play called A Raisin in the Sun.
A watershed moment in American theater.
The text tells us two vital things here. First, Lorraine Hansberry became the first Black woman to ever have a play performed on Broadway. Just think about the weight of that in 1959.
It's staggering.
Second, and this is the analytical kicker for our deep dive, the text says this play fundamentally changed how Black life was staged for the world.
Let's tie this directly back to the core thesis, owning the stage. For decades, centuries even, the representation of Black life on major, globally recognized stages was largely defined by minstrelsy, by tragedy written by cultural outsiders, or by flat, one-dimensional supporting characters.
Characters whose only purpose was to serve the white protagonist's storyline.
Lorraine Hansberry breaking that barrier is a seismic shift. Picture the scene. It's 1959, the lights go down in a major Broadway theater with a predominantly white audience, and for the first time, a Black woman is directing the narrative.
Presenting the story of the younger family.
A working-class Black family in Chicago dealing with very real, very complex dreams, financial struggles, housing discrimination, and internal family conflict.
It wasn't a play about monolithic, abstract suffering.
Huh.
It was about a specific family arguing over money, over dreams, over what kind of house they wanted to live in. It was universally relatable, precisely because it was so specifically authentic.
Exactly. When the text says it fundamentally changed how Black life was staged, it means that the narrative control finally shifted into the hands of the community itself. It is the profound difference between being a subject in someone else's play and being the playwright of your own existence.
To have a marginalized group finally dictate their own representation, to showcase their own internal family dynamics, their dignity, and their aspirations to a global mainstream audience on Broadway, that is the very definition of narrative liberation.
It forces the audience to see them as complex equals.
It's like the moment you stop letting other people introduce you at a party with a bunch of weird assumptions, and you finally get to grab the microphone and introduce yourself. Hi, this is who I actually am.
That's a great analogy.
But the evolution of this image doesn't stop on the theater stage. It moves to the silver screen, to Hollywood. And the Almanac gives us a fascinating comparison here by highlighting two actors born in this March window.
Let's look at how the text describes them, because the contrast is brilliant.
First, we have Tony Burton, born March 9th, 1937. The text describes him as an actor and former professional boxer, and specifically calls him a link in the chain of Black representation in Hollywood warrior roles, and it cites his famous role in the movie Rocky.
Yes, Tony Burton, who famously played Duke, the trainer in the Rocky franchise. What is analytically important here is the text categorizing this as the warrior role archetype.
The warrior archetype.
The warrior role is heavily tied to physical presence, to strength, to endurance, and to a very visceral, undeniable form of power. In the evolution of representation on screen, proving physical capability and demanding respect for that physical power is often an early and necessary step.
It is a powerful image, the Black warrior, the trainer, the fighter who cannot be broken.
It commands space on the screen. It is a reclaiming of physical dignity in a medium that, historically, often sought to physically diminish or emasculate marginalized men.
But then, the Almanac transitions just a few days later in the calendar to March 12, 1960, the birth of actor Courtney B. Vance. And the language the text uses to describe Vance's work is completely different.
It doesn't mention physical combat at all.
No, it says his work centers on the gravitas and complexity of the Black American experience.
And this is where we see the synthesis of how the narrative on screen evolves over time. We move from the sheer physical presence and undeniable strength of the warrior role, which, again, was vital and necessary for representation, to the deep, intellectual, nuanced complexity represented by the term gravitas.
Think of Courtney B. Vance's roles. He often plays brilliant lawyers, conflicted preachers, historical figures, intellectuals.
If we look at the trajectory of liberation, it mimics this exactly. First, you must prove you cannot be physically broken. You demand respect for your body. Then, as the narrative expands, you demand that the world acknowledges your intellectual depth, your moral conflicts, your legal acumen, and your emotional range.
By placing Burton and Vance within the same March cycle, the Almanac is showing us a timeline of representation.
It shows a marginalized group expanding their footprint in Hollywood from the physical arena into the arena of total, complex human experience. It is the journey from being seen primarily as a physical force to be reckoned with to being understood as a brilliant mind to be respected.
From the boxing ring to the courtroom, essentially. From physical might to intellectual gravitas. It's a beautiful way to track the expansion of the narrative. But sight, whether on Broadway or in Hollywood, is only one of our senses.
Right. There's another crucial dimension.
To truly own the journey and make it permanent, you have to make the world feel it. You have to get inside their heads and their hearts. And that brings us to the final and perhaps most expansive part of our deep dive, part 4. Liberating the sound and the state, the sonic frequency of freedom.
Sound is perhaps the most insidious, pervasive, and ultimately powerful form of narrative. You can choose to close your eyes to a stage, you can choose to put down a book, but sound surrounds you.
It bypasses the logical, cynical parts of the brain and hits the emotional core directly.
Owning the sound means owning the emotional frequency of an entire era. It dictates how people feel when they think about a movement.
And to start this section, we actually had to jump back slightly in the calendar to March 8, but the year is 1918. The Almanac notes the establishment and widespread circulation of Marcus Garvey's newspaper, The Negro World.
A hugely influential publication.
Now, I know what you are thinking. Wait, a newspaper is print. You read it. That's not sound. But look at the specific, brilliant metaphor the test uses to describe it. It describes this newspaper as acting as the global radio for the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and the broader Pan-African chain.
That metaphor is absolutely brilliant, and it requires a bit of context. The UNIA, founded by Garvey, was not a small club. It was a massive global movement in the 1920s with millions of members worldwide promoting Black nationalism and economic independence.
So why call their print newspaper a global radio?
Because in 1918, commercial radio was the burgeoning, cutting-edge technology of instant, mass, unified communication. By calling the Negro World the global radio, the text is highlighting its function, not just its physical format. Marcus Garvey used this paper to broadcast a unified, unapologetic narrative of Black pride, history, and self-reliance across the globe.
And here is where the sound comes in. It wasn't just read silently in private.
No, it was read aloud in barbershops, in meeting halls, on street corners, across the Caribbean, the Americas, and Africa. It literally created a shared sonic environment. It created a shared frequency of thought.
Before they had access to literal radio towers to broadcast their voices, they used the printing press and oral tradition to achieve the exact same effect.
Making sure everyone in the diaspora was vibrating at the exact same political and cultural frequency.
That's incredible. They essentially hacked the concept of global broadcasting before they actually owned the technology to do it. But this idea of owning your space, your story, and your frequency doesn't just apply to newspapers, plays, or music. It applies to entire massive stretches of land and millions of people.
The macro level.
Exactly. The Almanac suddenly shifts gears from culture directly into geopolitics, giving us two major national events in March that perfectly illustrate the ultimate form of narrative liberation. First, on March 12, 1968, we have Mauritius independence.
Gaining independence from the UK?
Yes, the text notes this island nation gained independence from the UK, marking a critical link in the decolonization of the Indian Ocean diaspora.
Decolonization is the ultimate macro-level application of our thesis. We spend this time talking about individuals legally owning their bodies and communities owning their image in films. Decolonization is an entire population, a massive geographic space, asserting the right to own its national journey.
Because when a nation is colonized, its story is written entirely by the colonizer.
Its resources are extracted for someone else's benefit. Its laws are written in a foreign capital. Its very identity is dictated from afar. Mauritius claiming its independence in 1968 is a critical link because it expands the narrative of liberation beyond the Atlantic, beyond the familiar stories of the Americas and West Africa, and firmly roots it in the Indian Ocean diaspora.
It proves that the frequency of freedom is truly global.
It is a nation standing up and saying, we will now be the authors of our own history.
And right next to that, on March 13, 1979, the text brings us to the Grenada Revolution. Now, looking at the Almanac, it's fascinating how it frames this politically charged moment. It doesn't take a stance on the Cold War politics of the era.
It remains strictly neutral, looking purely at the mechanics of how sovereignty shifted the narrative.
Exactly. It notes that Maurice Bishop and the New Jewel movement took power, establishing a government that explicitly focused on grassroots social programs and demanding Caribbean sovereignty.
Adhering strictly to the framework of the liberation of the narrative, we connect these geopolitical events, Mauritius in 68 and Grenada in 79, through the concept of sovereignty. Sovereignty is the geopolitical equivalent of owning the story.
It's claiming the ultimate agency.
Whether it is an island in the Indian Ocean shedding British rule, or an island in the Caribbean asserting its right to dictate its own social programs independent of foreign influence, these events represent the macro-level claiming of agency.
They are entire nations refusing to be supporting characters or mere subjects in someone else's empire.
Instead, they are demanding to be the protagonists on the world stage. It is the ultimate, highest-level expression of owning the journey. You own the land, you own the laws, you own the narrative.
Wow. From a single individual fighting not to be property on the Amistad in 1841 to entire sovereign nations demanding the pen to write their own laws. That is the incredible scale of what we were looking at.
Okay.
But let's bring it back down to the literal, actual sound.
It's a muse.
Let's talk about the music, because it is the glue that holds all of this together. The Almanac dedicates an incredible amount of space to 3 master architects of sound, all born right next to each other in mid-March. I'm just going to lay them out for you because the chronological and cultural progression is mind-blowing.
It's a perfect sequence.
First, March 11, 1947, the birth of Harvey Mason. The text calls him a prolific drummer who bridged the gap between jazz, funk, and modern hip-hop samples.
Keep that specific word in mind, bridged.
Okay, bridging. Next, March 13, 1972, the birth of Common. For those who might not be hip-hop heads, the text describes him as an architect of conscious rap. And it says he bridged the gap, there's that word again, between the boom bap of the 90s, which is that classic heavy drum and snare heartbeat of early hip-hop, and the deeply political art of today.
And then the final one.
And finally, the absolute crescendo of our almanac, March 14, 1933, the birth of Quincy Jones. I get so enthusiastic just reading this one. The text literally crowns him the master architect of the global diaspora sound.
Master architect.
It lists his unimaginable span, from arranging big band jazz to producing Michael Jackson's Thriller to scoring the film The Color Purple. And it concludes by saying he created the sonic frequency for the modern era.
This is the absolute perfect synthesis of the entire liberation of the narrative framework. Let's tie these musical elements back to the core thesis, owning the sound of the journey.
Music as a form of liberation.
Music is an invisible but omnipresent form of narrative liberation. It is how you make the world move to your rhythm, literally and figuratively. Let's look at the phrasing used for Quincy Jones, creating the sonic frequency for the modern era.
Think about the sheer cultural dominance required to do that.
He didn't just participate in music, he architected the sound that the entire globe tuned into for decades. He defined the emotional resonance of late 20th century pop culture. When a marginalized culture produces the master architect of global sound, they have undeniably captured the narrative.
And look at how the other 2 musicians are described. Harvey Mason bridging jazz, funk, and hip-hop samples. Common bridging 90s boom bap and modern political art. What does all this bridging actually mean in the practical context of narrative liberation?
It means that the sound of freedom is continuous, and it speaks to multiple generations simultaneously. By bridging genres, these artists ensure that the history of the struggle, the joy, and the culture is carried forward into the future without being lost.
It works like a chain.
It works exactly like this. Harvey Mason's incredibly complex drum beats from a 1970s jazz funk track get sampled by a 1990s hip-hop producer. That sample creates the backing track for a rapper like Common to lay down a verse about modern political art, systemic racism, or community love.
It is an unbroken chain of sonic data.
It is a brilliant way of archiving the culture through rhythm. When you own the sound, you ensure that your narrative can never be silenced or erased because it is literally echoing out of the speakers in every car, every club, every pair of headphones, and every living room on the planet.
It bridges generations, connecting the big band era of the 1930s to the hip-hop era of the 2000s, proving that the story is always evolving. But the frequency remains strong, defiant, and entirely their own.
It's an unbroken frequency of freedom.
Okay, we need to take a deep breath and zoom out, because we have covered an immense amount of ground today. Let's summarize this journey for everyone listening so you can see the whole picture.
It's important to see the through line.
We started this deep dive in 1841, looking at the raw, foundational necessity of physical liberation with the Amistad decision, proving under the law that a human being is not property, but a free individual. We saw Harriet Tubman transition from a physical general on the treacherous Underground Railroad to a permanent, unkillable spiritual legend.
We then explored the complex architecture required to maintain and grow that freedom. We saw the logistical coordination required to manifest the Pan-African Conference in London in 1900. We shined a light on the invisible but vital labor of Black women.
Hallie Quinn Brown and Claudia Jones.
Yes, we unpacked Hallie Quinn Brown's profound mandate to lift as we climb, and Claudia Jones demanding we see the complex intersection of race, class, and gender rather than simple single-issue politics. We even saw how the memory of Fannie Lou Hamer is deployed as strategic architecture to secure the ongoing right to vote today.
From there, we stepped out of the shadows and onto the stage and the screen. We watched Lorraine Hansberry force Broadway to see the nuanced truth of Black family life, rejecting the caricatures of the past.
Changing the visual representation forever.
And we tracked the evolution of the Hollywood image from the raw, undeniable physical power of Tony Burton's warrior archetype to the deep intellectual gravitas of Courtney B. Vance. And finally, we tuned into the frequency.
The global radio.
We saw Marcus Garvey's newspaper act as a global radio before radio was even a thing. We saw entire nations like Mauritius and Grenada claiming their sovereign storylines on the world stage. And we listened to the musical master architects, Harvey Mason, Common, and Quincy Jones, who ensured that this entire historical journey had a beat the whole world couldn't help but feel.
And this brings us to the final essential takeaway for you, the listener. What this single week in March, this microcosm of history, teaches us is that true freedom is profoundly multi-layered. It is never just one thing, and it is never achieved in a single moment.
It's an ongoing process.
It absolutely requires the physical, legal right to exist without chains. But that is just the beginning. True freedom requires the logistical network to organize and sustain your community. It requires the stage and the screen to show your true, unedited complexity to the world. And it requires the sound, the cultural resonance to make the world actually feel your truth.
Freedom is a continuous act of creation.
It is the ongoing daily process of moving from being a passive subject in history to becoming the author, the director, and the composer of your own destiny.
Which leaves me with one final provocative thought for you to chew on as you go about the rest of your day. We spent this entire time talking about how these monumental historical figures claimed ownership of their narrative, fighting tooth and nail to move from the physical body to the global stage.
And now it applies to you.
Exactly. I want you to think about your own life right now. Think about your own career, your family, or your own community. We live in an age where we are constantly bombarded by outside information, endless notifications, and other people's algorithms telling us what to buy, how we should feel, and who we are supposed to be.
A constant barrage of narratives.
So I ask you, in the midst of all that modern noise, who is currently writing your narrative? And what is the very first step you need to take tomorrow to finally own the story, the stage, and the sound of your own journey?
Oh, that's a big question to start with.
Right. But if you are like most people listening to this right now, your brain probably